I wrote this question down because Jonathan was asking great questions and I got sidetracked. But I think this question is for Paul.
Okay. Yeah.
If God told you the Earth was indeed billions of years old, this is a hypothetical. So if you can imagine yourself in a red Ferrari, you can imagine this situation. If God told you the Earth was indeed billions of years old, how would you now see the geological time gap evidence as we see? And would your explanation now be the same as the old Earthers?
Well, it's a strange question, really, because we're dealing obviously with hypotheticals, and I don't think God has said that the world is billions of years old. I guess I would be forced into that position. Yeah, if you think that the time scale over which those sediments was deposited amounts to hundreds of millions of years, I don't see any other option. You have to assume that most of the sediment is missing. The record is full of time gaps, and I don't know what you do with the bioturbation evidence.
Can you explain to us, like, very, very simply? Like, I was getting a little confused through a little bit, but what do the people who disagree with you, who are geologists, say does explain the time gaps?
Well, they invoke the time gaps because radiometric dating requires them, but they acknowledge that actually trying to identify where all that time is in the record is a problem, which is the point. You know, where do we put all of that missing time?
But what's their explanation?
Their explanation
for the time gaps?
Well, sedimentation is not continuous in any one location on the surface of the Earth, right? So sedimentation is by its nature today episodic. And you have periods of sedimentation interspersed with periods of erosion. I mean, nobody questions that. That's true. Sediments that are eroded in one place will end up being deposited somewhere else. You know, so in any one location, the record won't be complete. Everybody agrees with that. The question is, are those time gaps long or short? And are we having to invoke evidence of time gaps where the physical evidence is really not supported?
But what do they say exactly? Like, help me understand this. What do they say exactly is the cause, maybe, for these time gaps? What causes it?
Well, simply, in any place on the Earth's surface, one of two things is going to happen: either erosion or sedimentation.
But what causes that erosion or sedimentation to be different?
Sorry?
What causes that erosion or sedimentation to be different?
To be different.
What would cause it to, let's say, what would cause it, for example, to have long periods of time of erosion with no sedimentation versus a period of time with sedimentation and very little erosion? Like, what actually causes these phenomena that causes these time gaps that we see?
Well, generally speaking, if you are elevated above the ocean, you will be subjected to erosion. Okay, so a continent is largely being subjected to erosion. There are places where deposition is happening on continents, in lakes and rivers and so on, but generally speaking, a continent is going to be subject to net erosion. If, on the other hand, you're in the shallow ocean, you might be experiencing net deposition, net sedimentation, net accumulation of sediments. So geologists assume that one or other of those two things is happening. Okay, there isn't a third option. You know.
Right.
Okay, so
my understanding is that it's basically the mantle shifts, which causes the folding and for things to be above the ocean or above water for a while, and then other. So is that the explanation that the old earthers would give? Is just mantle shifts?
Yeah, uplift and erosion. Okay. You know, if sediments, or I guess you could envisage some places in the ocean where sedimentation is very, very slow. But even then, sedimentation is still happening. It's just happening very slowly. So
yeah, I understand.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, during those breaks when erosion is happening, you're just that's just not preserved in the record. Okay, it's not represented by sediment. I don't know whether I'm communicating this very well.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at, and I guess, Jonathan, if you allow me, this is a question, I guess, for both Stephen and Paul. And it's relating to what Jonathan said. Like, if you're coming from the point of view that the authority of Scripture comes first, and any evidence that we see might go against Scripture, we have to, it's our fault. Like, we're seeing the evidence wrong. And shame on us because it doesn't fit with what we see in Scripture. But if you come from that point of view, then what Jonathan was saying, people with a different holy book could say, well, yeah, it seems like the evidence goes against our book here, but that's our fault. We're just seeing the evidence wrong. If you guys did not know of the Bible at all, do you think you would be old earthers or young earthers?
Well, I think that's very hard to say because, again, it's a hypothetical, and my honest answer is I don't know. I suspect if I didn't have the Bible, I would probably be an old earther because that simply, if for example, your view is that the present is the key to the past. Okay, we look at processes of sedimentation and erosion going on around us today. They're typically very slow, and your assumption, I think, would be, well, maybe that's just always how things have operated. What I see happening today has always operated in the past. Inevitably, I think you would come to the conclusion that the Earth was old because processes have always operated extremely slowly, just as you observe them today. Without revelation to tell me that actually the past has been very different from the present, would I necessarily come to the conclusion of a young Earth? I don't know. I think there would be aspects of the sedimentary record that I've talked about that I think should be problematic. They should be kind of thorns in the saddle for your explanation that the Earth is very old. And I think the evidence of catastrophism in the record should point you to the fact that the past is not the same as what's going on at the present. Does that help? So
yeah, I really do appreciate your answer. Like you basically saying, I don't know. But I would love to hear Stephen's thoughts on this as well. Like if you could wipe the biblical portion of your brain away and you saw the evidence that we have in your field, would you be an old earther or a young earther?
Well, I don't think I want to go over sort of Paul's answers. I think I'd probably go down a similar sort of route when you're talking like that about the evidence. I mean, I suppose that the point when you asked that sort of question, the point that I was thinking of is that you've got to, people sort of say, well, how can you be a real scientist if you've got this sort of axiom that you're beginning with from Scripture? And to me, you've got to separate the scientific model you've got from the scriptural teaching. And just in sort of very broad terms, why do I believe in Noah's flood? It's not ultimately because of different bits of rock I see. It's because of what I see in Scripture and Jesus' testimony and all that. So I then come and look at the world and try and develop a model to try and understand the rock layers or whatever in terms of the flood. It's possible for that scientific model to be disproved, or at least discredited at some level. Because you can produce different scientific evidence that show my model just really does not work. That does not shake my belief in the flood because it's bound by Scripture. It does get me to say, well, actually, I've got a rubbish model here. I need to get a better one. And in a funny sort of way, that allows me to be more dispassionate as a scientist than I would argue than an atheist, where your whole epistemology in part rests on science. And so the whole thing sort of rests on the answers you get there. So I would argue I can actually be more dispassionate as a scientist. I can cope with my model being disproved more easily. I'm not quite sure that's really what you're asking, but
well, let me. This is my last question, and Jonathan,
to me,
thank you.
You've got to separate those two things.
And Jonathan, thank you for letting me on here. But I'll just ask this, and you don't have to answer now. But is there any evidence that you could see in your field that would lower your confidence in Scripture?
That's it depends what you mean by my field. There's plenty of scientific, data and evidence that can get me to ask questions and things that I won't necessarily understand or be able to answer. But fundamentally, my belief in Scripture rests on something else. It is not on how well science does or does not fit with this. And in a way, that gets back to the questions Jonathan was asking. And it's, I need to think a little bit the right way to sort of explain all that. But that's, it comes back to the basic epistemology.